Some rooms hold more than just memories. Some remember death too well. That was what the charge nurse once told me when I first started working the night shift at St. Elora Hospital. At the time, I thought she was just being dramatic, warning the new nurse to add some mystery to the job, but she looked serious. And when she told me never to assign anyone to room 409, her voice dropped just a little, like she had lived something she could not forget. She never explained why, just that it was not worth the risk. The staff followed the rule without question, even when we were short on space. Room 409 stayed empty. It was clean, stocked, ready like the rest, but it was never used. For months, I followed the rule too, curious but obedient. Then came the night we had an emergency patient surge, and no rooms were available. We had ambulances lining up, patients waiting in hallways, and families growing frustrated. My supervisor was not around, and I was left making fast decisions, so I did what I thought was logical. I assigned a quiet, stable patient, Mr. Allen, to room 409. He had come in earlier that day, with chest tightness, but his vitals were fine. Nothing urgent. He was joking with me when I wheeled him to the room, thanking me for the quiet corner and the view. I smiled, told him to rest, and assured him we would check on him in a bit. At that moment, nothing felt wrong, but about 45 minutes later, his heart monitor started alarming. We rushed in to find him unresponsive. He had coded. We started CPR, pushed meds, brought him back, after what felt like forever. When he finally woke up, gasping and weak, he locked eyes with me and whispered something that made my blood run cold. He said, "The man in black told me it was time." I asked him what he meant, thinking he was confused, but he repeated it, clearer now. A tall man, black suit, just stood over me. I could not breathe. He leaned close and said it was time. I told the doctor, but they brushed it off as a side effect of oxygen loss, hallucinations, nothing to worry about. But I could not stop thinking about it. The next day, I went to the staff records and pulled up old incident reports. I searched room 409 and found something that turned my stomach. 5 previous patients over the last 10 years had died in that room. All of them were considered low risk. All of them had coded suddenly within hours of being admitted. There were whispers in the nurse notes, words like unexpected, unexplained, and one report even mentioned the patient saying he felt watched. I brought this to my supervisor, and she finally told me the story I had been missing. 10 years ago, a priest was brought into room 409 after collapsing during a sermon. He was not supposed to make it, but he did, and when he woke, he screamed for hours, kept shouting that something was in the room, said he saw shadows that were not shadows, and a man with no face standing in the corner. The staff thought it was brain trauma, but the priest kept saying the same thing, over and over. He comes at 2:17. 2 nights later, at 2:17 a.m., the priest coded and died. His body was ice cold, even though the room's temperature was normal. That was when they stopped using the room. The next few nights, I avoided that wing as much as possible, but the fear had started to bleed into my dreams. I would wake up at 2:17 every night, sweating, heart racing, feeling like someone had been standing beside my bed. I started hearing soft taps on the window of my break room, even when no one was outside. One night, while doing rounds, I walked past room 409 and froze. The lights were off, but I could see movement inside, just a faint shift, like someone standing still and slowly turning. I opened the door with my flashlight ready, but the room was empty. The next morning, I returned to the records and pulled up the priest's file. His name was Father Harlan. Before his collapse, he had been giving a sermon about death, not just the end of life, but what he called the crossing. He claimed that some people do not die alone, that something watches, something waits. He warned his congregation that death has a face, and if you ever see it too early, it might not let you leave. That was the last thing he ever preached. I wanted to believe this was just a coincidence. Stress, fatigue, a story built over time that had taken on a life of its own. But Mr. Allen recovered and requested to be moved to another room. He told the staff he would not sleep in 409 again. He said the man in black came back the second night, stood in the corner silently watching. No words, just that cold presence. We moved him. After that, I made sure 409 stayed locked. No matter how busy we got, I would never make that mistake again. I even placed a handwritten note inside the room's cabinet, just in case some future nurse thought about using it. It said, "Do not assign patients here. He comes at 2:17. I left the hospital a few years later, but every so often, I check the news. No surprise, St. Elora built a new wing, and I heard they finally tore down the older rooms. But part of me wonders where the man in black went. Was it just that room, or does he follow the rules of death in ways we cannot understand? All I know is this: death may not knock for all of us. Sometimes, he simply steps into the room and whispers, 'It is time.' And if you ever hear that voice when no one is there, pray it is not 2:17. Some silences feel heavier than words, like the building itself is holding its breath. That was something my mentor Clara told me during my first week as a night nurse at Millgrove General. I laughed when she said it, thinking she was being poetic or just tired, but her face stayed serious. She told me the hospital changed at night, especially on the lower floors. I brushed it off like everyone does at first. After a while, you get used to the routine. You get used to patients crying out in the middle of the night, monitors beeping, machines clicking, and even the quiet moments when everything seems still. But the elevators, they always felt different, heavy, almost like they had a mind of their own. And there was one night, one ride, that changed how I saw everything. It was a slow Tuesday night, the kind that drags on and makes you more tired than a busy shift ever could. I was moving between the second and fifth floors, checking vitals, adjusting IVs, and making sure meds were set up for the early morning staff. Around 3 a.m., I needed to deliver a chart back to the nurse station on the third floor. I was on 5, and instead of taking the stairs, I decided to take the elevator. I pressed the button, waited, and when the doors opened, I stepped in, alone. I pressed the button for 3, and leaned against the rail, just wanting the shift to end. The elevator started moving, but instead of stopping at 3, it passed it, and went down, not just down to 2 or 1, but lower, into the basement. At first, I thought it was a glitch. The elevators had been acting up for weeks, and maintenance had been slow. But when I looked at the panel, the button for the basement had not been pressed. None of the buttons were lit up, except the one for floor 3. But the elevator just kept going. When it stopped, the doors opened slowly, with a quiet ding that echoed more than it should have. It was dark beyond the doorway, and I instantly knew something was wrong. That basement had been closed off for years. It used to be the morgue before the hospital upgraded, but it was sealed and unused now, storage at best. I had never been down there. No one had, at least not in the last few years. But the second the doors opened, I saw her, a woman, standing just outside the elevator, facing me. She wore a hospital gown, bare feet. Her hair hung long and dark, and her skin was pale, like paper. But the thing that froze me was her smile. It was wide and strange, like it had been carved onto her face. Her eyes were open but empty, and she did not move, just stood there, watching, smiling. I could not breathe. My hands went cold. I tried pressing the button to close the doors, to go back up, but nothing worked. I hit every floor. I hit the emergency call. Nothing. The elevator just stayed open, the lights flickering slightly. 30 seconds passed. I counted every one. I stared at her the whole time, and she never blinked, never stepped forward, never said a word. Then she vanished, just gone, like a light switching off. One blink, and she was no longer there. The elevator doors closed immediately, and it moved back up to the 3rd floor, like nothing had happened. I stumbled out when it opened, and sat at the nurse station, trying to make sense of what I saw. My hands were still shaking when Clara came over. She took one look at me, and knew something had happened. When I told her, her face went pale. She sat down beside me, and asked, was she smiling? When I nodded, she sighed, and looked down at her hands. She told me I was not the first to see the woman. Over the years, other nurses had reported the same thing, an elevator going to the basement on its own, the woman standing there, in a gown, silent and smiling. Some believed it was the ghost of a patient who died in the old morgue. Others thought it was something darker. Clara said the legend started with a woman named Eleanor Fields. She had been admitted years ago after a failed suicide attempt. No family, no visitors. She barely spoke. Then one night, during the graveyard shift, she disappeared. She found her body the next morning in the morgue freezer, which no one could explain, since it had already been closed off. There were no footprints, no camera footage, nothing. Just her frozen body, and that same eerie smile on her face. Ever since then, staff began seeing her in the elevator, or walking the basement halls during the early morning hours. No one ever saw her move, just appear and vanish. That every single sighting shared one detail: the smile. After that night, I avoided the elevator as much as possible. If I had to use it, I made sure I was not alone. Sometimes it would still glitch, stop between floors, or make that strange hum like it was listening. The worst part was that some nights, especially around 3 a.m., I would pass by the elevator and see that it was sitting idle on the basement level. No one called it, no one used it, but it would just sit there, open, waiting. I started leaving work 5 minutes early, just to avoid being in the building alone. Clara eventually retired. Before she left, she told me, some doors are meant to stay closed. That elevator is not just a machine, it remembers. I never saw the woman again after that first time, but I still dream about her. The elevator opens, and she is there, smiling, waiting for me to step out, and I never do. I just stand there, frozen, knowing that if I move an inch, I will never come back. I am not the only one who has seen her, and I am sure I will not be the last. But if you ever work the night shift at Millgrove General, and the elevator suddenly takes you somewhere you did not ask to go, do not step out, and whatever you do, do not smile back. The hardest part of being a night nurse is staying awake when the silence starts talking to you. That's what my friend Jess once said. We were working the late shift on the pediatric floor, just the two of us. It was around 2 a.m. in day, and the hospital had quieted down, the kind of stillness that made every creak and groan of the old building feel a little more unsettling. We had just finished checking on the kids when we saw her, the little girl, running past the nurse's station. At first it seemed normal. There was always someone walking around at night, checking in on things, but as she passed, Jess looked up and asked, "Who is that? She's not one of our patients, right?" The girl had been wearing an old-fashioned dress, something you wouldn't see kids wearing in this day and age. It was a faded pink with lace trim, and she had no shoes. She was fast, like she had a purpose, and she didn't stop when we called after her. I froze, feeling a coldness settle in my chest, but Jess just brushed it off as one of the regular night shift glitches. Probably one of the visitors' kids, she said, even though it didn't make sense. No one else was supposed to be on the floor at that hour. The odd thing was, this wouldn't be the last time we saw her. The girl kept appearing in the same spot, always in the same hurried run, and always at the same time, around 2:15 a.m. Sometimes she was closer, sometimes farther down the hall, but always she wore that old-fashioned dress. At first we thought we were imagining it, but after a while we both started to feel the hairs on the back of our necks rise whenever the time approached. One night, I decided to follow her. I thought maybe she was sneaking into one of the rooms, or playing in a way she wasn't supposed to. I told Jess I was going to check the back hallway, but as I turned the corner, I saw her again, running straight toward the exit, at the end of the hall. I quickened my pace to catch up, but when I reached the end of the corridor, she was gone. There was no sign of her, no sound of running feet. It was like she had disappeared into thin air. My heart was pounding. I rushed back to the nurse's station, hoping to find Jess, but when I told her, she just shook her head. "You're imagining things," she said with a laugh, but her voice wavered a little too much to be entirely convincing. We both tried to ignore the feeling of being watched, but the next few nights it got worse. Every time we passed the rooms, there was something new. Tiny handprints on the inside of the windows too high for any of the kids to reach. At first, I thought it was just the kids playing with their hands on the glass, but no, these prints were smaller, perfectly shaped, and placed far too high for any of the children in our care. I asked Jess if she noticed, and she hesitated before saying, "Yeah, I've seen them too, but they weren't there when we first checked the rooms." And she was right. When we'd gone through the rooms earlier, there had been nothing on the windows, but after the girl ran by, they always appeared. At first, I convinced myself it was just some strange coincidence, but each time it happened, the sense of unease grew. Something was wrong, but neither of us could explain it. Then came the night we couldn't deny it anymore. Jess and I had just finished our rounds, and were sitting in the break room, sipping our cold coffee, trying to stay awake. It was just after 2 a.m. when I saw her again, the girl in the pink dress running past the nurse's station. But this time, I stood up before Jess could say anything, and I followed her. My heart was in my throat as I walked quickly down the hall, eyes scanning for her. The closer I got, the faster my pulse raced. I turned the corner, and nothing. She was gone. But when I looked up, I saw the faint outline of a figure standing at the end of the hall, too tall to be the girl. My stomach dropped. It was a shadow, dark and shifting, with no real form, just a vague silhouette. It looked like it was watching me. I stepped back, my body tense, but then I heard a noise from behind me, a soft sound, like tapping. I turned around, and there she was, the girl, standing in front of the nearest room, her smile wide and unsettling. I froze. She didn't move, but her eyes met mine, and I felt a chill like I had never known before. I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, but no words came, and then, just like that, she disappeared into thin air. My legs went weak, and I stumbled back to the nurse's station, my hands shaking. Jess was there, her face pale. "You saw her too, didn't you?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. It felt like the whole building was holding its breath, waiting for something else to happen. That's when I told Jess about the handprints. She looked at me for a long time before she spoke. "I've been seeing them too. They weren't there before. They just appear after she runs by." That night, we called security to investigate, but of course, nothing was found. No trace of the girl, no sign of anything unusual. They checked the cameras, nothing. Just us, walking the halls, doing our jobs like normal. But after that night, we couldn't ignore the truth anymore. The girl wasn't just a figment of our imagination. She was something else, something that didn't belong. In the weeks that followed, the sightings stopped, but the handprints remained. And every time I walk down that hall, I still feel her watching me, waiting for me. No one knows who the girl was, or why she kept appearing. All I know is that sometimes, in the dead of night, when the building is at its quietest, you can hear a faint sound, like running footsteps, and feel the unmistakable cold chill of someone standing too close, someone who isn't supposed to be there, someone who never left. Sometimes, you hear things you are not supposed to hear in a hospital. I remember hearing those words from one of the senior nurses during my first week on the ICU floor. It seemed like a harmless comment, something just meant to reassure me about the eerie stillness that often settled over the unit late at night. But after a while, I began to realize that there was more truth to those words than I had originally thought. The ICU was always full of life and death, and I had become accustomed to the rhythm of it all. The beeping monitors, the shuffling feet, the quiet murmur of voices, it all seemed normal. That is, until the call bell began ringing. But there was something strange about this bell. It hadn't worked in years. The old call bell system had been disconnected during a renovation, yet on certain nights, around the same time, a single bell would ring out loud and clear from a room that no one ever used anymore. The bell was a faint, high-pitched sound, the kind that might remind you of something ancient, forgotten, or warning you of something you should not ignore. It was never loud enough to call for attention, but just enough to make your blood run cold. At first, I thought I was imagining it, or perhaps just hearing things after long shifts. After all, a hospital like ours always had its creaks and groans, its old pipes and electrical buzzes. But then, I began to notice that other nurses had heard it too. It was always the same bell, the same eerie ring, echoing down the hall from room 402. Room 402 hadn't been used in years. The bed had long been removed, the equipment covered with dust, and the room itself had been out of commission since the old call bell system had been shut down. Yet, whenever the bell rang, it was always the same pattern, just 3 faint chimes, like a warning, and then silence. The first time I heard it, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe someone had mistakenly pressed the button, or maybe it was just some kind of malfunction. But as the weeks went by, I began to hear it more frequently, and each time, it was always before the death of a patient on the unit. It started off small: patients who were already in critical condition, patients whose time was inevitably running out. Nurses would be gathered around a patient, discussing their care, when suddenly the call bell would ring. Everyone would freeze, looking at each other in confusion, but no one would mention it, and no one would go to check the room. It was just part of the rhythm now, a part of the strange atmosphere that seemed to follow us in the ICU. But then, the calls became harder to ignore. I remember one particularly chilling night, when I was in the break room with a few other nurses. We were all talking quietly, trying to stay awake through the late shift when the bell rang again. 3 soft chimes that cut through the stillness. We all froze. One of the nurses, Carol, spoke up first, her voice trembling slightly. "It's coming from room 402, she said, her face pale. "It's happening again." We all knew what that meant. The bell always rang before a patient died. No one could explain it, but the pattern was undeniable. We had come to expect it, and yet, every time it happened, it was just as unsettling as the first. That night, it was a man in his mid-60s who had been in a coma for weeks. The bell rang, and less than 5 minutes later, his heart monitor flatlined. I felt a chill run through me as I stood there, watching the nurses rush to his side. It was as if the bell had been a signal, a harbinger of what was to come. But it wasn't the last time. Over the next few weeks, the bell rang several more times, always from the same room. Each time a patient would pass away shortly after. It was like clockwork. But one night, something changed. I had just finished a long round of patient checks, and was heading back to the nurse's station, when the bell rang again. This time, I wasn't in the break room. I was walking down the hall, and the sound was unmistakable. It was coming from room 402. I felt my heart skip a beat. I walked toward the room, my legs heavy with unease. The bell's sound grew louder as I neared, echoing down the hallway. When I reached the door, I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the knob. Something told me I shouldn't go in, but I couldn't stop myself. I turned the handle and opened the door. The room was empty, just as I had expected. No one was inside. The bed was still gone, the floor covered in dust. But there, on the floor next to the wall, was a small, old-fashioned call bell, the very same one that had been disconnected years ago. It was sitting there, resting on the floor, as if it had always been there. My mind raced. Had someone placed it there recently? How could it possibly have been ringing? But the question that really haunted me was why? Why had it been ringing at all? Why had it rung before every death? That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something had changed in that room. I spoke to a few of the senior nurses about it, but they only looked at me with knowing eyes, as if they had heard this story 100 times before. You heard it, didn't you? One of them asked me. I nodded, and she sighed deeply. Room 402. It's always been like that. The bell rings just before they go. It's like the room knows. She didn't say anything else, and neither did the others. It was like they all knew something that I didn't. Something dark and unexplainable. After that night, the bell stopped ringing. No more calls from room 402. No more warning sounds just before death. I don't know why it stopped, but I can't shake the feeling that something still lingers in that room. Sometimes when I walk down the hall, I can still hear the faint echo of a bell ringing in my ears. Maybe it's just the memory of those nights, or maybe something is still waiting in room 402, waiting for the bell to ring once more. Sometimes you hear voices in a hospital, especially at night. You convince yourself it's just the stress, the tiredness, or maybe even the isolation that plays tricks on your mind. I had heard this saying from a fellow nurse early on in my career, but I didn't truly understand it until one shift that changed everything. I was working a late night shift in the medical ward, and like most nights, it was quiet. The kind of quiet that was unsettling in itself. The kind of quiet that wraps around you and makes the hours drag on. My round started like any other. I checked on my patients, making sure they were comfortable, their medications were on time, and their vital signs were stable. Most of them were asleep, but one room, room 304, had 2 patients. One was an elderly woman named Mrs. Jackson, who had been there for a few days after surgery. She was quiet, a bit disoriented, but she was always polite and kind whenever I checked on her. The other bed, however, was empty. It had been empty all day, and no one had been assigned there. So as I walked into the room, I casually approached the empty bed and asked, "Do you need anything?" It was a simple routine question I asked every patient, but when the voice responded, it froze me in my tracks. "No, thank you." The voice was calm, polite, but unmistakably clear. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone in the bed, perhaps another patient who had been admitted in the middle of the day, without my knowledge, but the bed was empty. I stood there, my mind racing. Had I heard that voice right? Was I imagining it? It wasn't uncommon for hospitals to feel eerie in the dead of night, but this was different. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong, and walked over to Mrs. Jackson's bed, hoping to dismiss the incident as nothing more than exhaustion playing tricks on me. But she didn't look like she was sleeping. She was staring at me with wide, unsettled eyes. She was always a bit confused, but tonight, there was something else in her gaze. "He talks to me too," she whispered, barely audible. I looked at her, confused, and then glanced over at the empty bed again. He? Who was she talking about? Mrs. Jackson had always been a sweet woman, but I'd never known her to be delusional. She had made no mention of anyone else in the room before. I didn't know what to say, so I smiled politely and told her, "Everything is fine, Mrs. Jackson. If you need anything, just press the call button." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The voice had been too real, too clear to be a figment of my imagination. But there was no one in the bed, and no one else in the room, except for Mrs. Jackson and me. I quickly finished my check on her, telling myself that I was simply overworked, and probably hearing things. But the unease stayed with me. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. Bowenel supposed. I left the room, and made my way to the nurse's station, trying to focus on the work at hand. But I couldn't forget the voice. I couldn't forget Mrs. Jackson's words. They echoed in my mind. "He talks to me too." I asked one of the other nurses who had been on the floor longer if there had been any mention of another patient being placed in room 304, or if there had been any unusual occurrences in that room. She looked at me strangely, as if I had asked an odd question. "No, room 304 has been empty for days." "I don't know what you're talking about." I must have looked more unsettled than I felt, because she reached out and placed a hand on my arm. "You're probably just tired, hun. It happens to all of us. That room gives off bad energy sometimes. We all avoid it when we can." I laughed it off, trying to ease my discomfort, but the words stayed with me. Bad energy. It sounded like nothing more than superstition, but it left me feeling unnerved. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the following evening, I was back on my regular shift. Iterd of Mida, and energy Arine. I was back on my regular shift. As I made my rounds, I found myself once again walking past room 304. This time I paused outside the door, listening. The floor was eerily quiet, as it always was at night, but I could swear I heard something from within the room, a low whispering. I hesitated, but my curiosity got the best of me, and I slowly pushed open the door. The room was empty, just as it had been the night before, but this time, there was something different. I could feel a presence in the room, something that wasn't there before. A cold chill seemed to settle around me. As I stepped further into the room, I felt as if I was being drawn toward the empty bed, as if something invisible was calling me. Suddenly, I heard the voice again. "No, thank you." It was clear, calm and eerily polite. But this time, it wasn't just the voice I heard. I felt it. A coldness washed over me, and my skin crawled with the sensation that I wasn't alone. I whipped around, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was nothing. No patient, no staff, just the empty room. I backed out of the room quickly, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was safely back at the nurse's station. I couldn't explain what had happened. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical reason for everything, but nothing made sense. Why had Mrs. Jackson mentioned if there was no one in the room? Why did I hear the voice again? And why was it always so clear? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. What was in that room? Why did it feel so cold? And what did Mrs. Jackson know that I didn't? Later, I would learn from the night shift nurses that room 304 had a long history. Years ago, there had been a patient who passed away in that room, a man who had never been properly identified. His presence had been felt by many, but he was never seen. And now, it seemed like he was still there, haunting that room, waiting for someone to hear his voice. I never went near room 304 again. After that night, I couldn't. I don't know if it was the restless spirit of the man who had died there, or something else entirely, but I will never forget the voice that calmly replied, "No thank you," from an empty bed.